Hey guys, this is part 2 of chapter 20 of Alan Brinkley's textbook. Parties and interest groups, decline of party influence. The reformers did not eliminate parties, but they did contribute to a decline of party influence, as can be seen through the decline of voter turnout. So why did voter turnout decline? Is because the secret ballot made party bosses have less ability to get voters to the polls. Also, illiterate voters had trouble reading the new ballot. And third, because interest groups began to replace voters. These included social workers, women's clubs, and others who voted to advance their demands. Labor, the machine, and reform. Labor. Some labor unions also wanted reform. Machine. New York City's Tammany Hall, the most notorious city machine, began to use its power to improve working conditions and protect child laborers. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire was a fire in a company that killed 146 workers, and many were trapped inside the building because the emergency exits were locked to prevent malingering. This horrific fire led to the passing of stricter regulations of factory owners and established effective mechanisms for enforcement. Western progressives. Many Western states produced notable progressive leaders. Western states were mostly concerned about the federal government, not state governments, because federal governments had much more power. There were often disputes over which states had the right to rivers, and only the federal government could solve this. The federal government also had power over lands and resources of the West. Huge areas of the West were public lands. Much of the growth of the West was a result of federally funded dams and water projects. African Americans and reform. W.E.B. Du Bois was the leading spokesman for reform. He wrote The Souls of Black Folk in 1903, where he attacked the approach of Booker T. Washington, accusing him of encouraging whites to impose segregation. African Americans should get a full university education, get the professions, and above all, fight for their civil rights. NAACP. Du Bois and his supporters met at Niagara Falls and launched the Niagara Movement. Then, white progressives joined and became the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Some victories was a Supreme Court case called Ginn versus the United States, where they said the grandfather clause in Oklahoma was unconstitutional. In Buchanan versus Worley, the Supreme Court struck down a Louisville law requiring segregation. Lynching. There was lynching in the South. Du Bois wanted a federal law to make lynching illegal. The most determined opponents of lynching were Southern women. The Temperance Crusade. Women's Christian Temperance Union. Temperance formed the WCTU and became the single largest women's organization to that point. The Anti-Saloon League also formed, and with WCTU, they wanted to abolish saloons and prohibit the sale and manufacture of alcoholic beverages. The 18th Amendment. By 1916, 19 states passed prohibition laws. In 1920, the 18th Amendment banned alcohol. Immigration restriction. Almost all reformers thought immigrants created social problems. Some progressives thought the proper approach was to help them adapt, but others wanted to limit the arrival of immigrants. Eugenics and nativism. People thought immigrants were polluting the racial stock. Eugenics was the science of altering the reproductive process of plants and animals to produce new hybrids or breeds. They wanted to turn eugenics into human reproduction as well. Eugenics bred the belief that human inequalities were hereditary and that immigration was causing more unfit people. The dream of socialism. Eugene Debs and the Socialist Party. Eugene Debs was the presidential candidate of the American Socialist Party. Socialists attracted urban immigrant communities, especially German and Jews, and Protestant farmers in the South and West, and women reformers. And they supported labor organizing. The IWW, or Wobblies, was a militant labor union, and they advocated a single union for all workers and the abolition of the wage slave system. They rejected political action in favor of strikes, dynamite railroad lines and power stations, and other terror acts. They had strength in the West, but started to decline when federal authorities imprisoned the leaders of the union and many state governments outlawed the IWW. Socialism's demise. When socialists refused to support World War I, it led to their demise in harassment and persecution. Decentralization and regulation. Reformers knew corporations were inevitable, and it would be impossible to get rid of all corporations, but they wanted the federal government to break up the largest combinations and enforce a balance. The problem of corporate centralization. Louis Brandeis was a justice of the Supreme Court and wrote about the curse of bigness. The accidental president. Theodore Roosevelt became president after McKinley was assassinated. Roosevelt was a rancher, police commissioner, assistant secretary of the Navy, and led the charge in the Battle of San Juan Hill in the Spanish-American War. Roosevelt urged regulation, but not destruction of the trusts. He wanted the federal government to investigate the activities of corporations and publicize the results. In the past, federal governments usually supported the employers, but he cared about both workers and employers. The Square Deal, Hepburn Act. During the 1904 campaign, where Roosevelt was reelected, Roosevelt said that he had worked in the anthracite coal strike to provide everyone with a square deal. His first target was the powerful railroads. Before, there was the Interstate Commerce Act that let the government regulate railroads, but lost influence. The Hepburn Railroad Regulation Act sought to restore federal government regulation on railroads, but also did not do much. Pure Food and Drug Act. Roosevelt also enacted the Pure Food and Drug Act, which restricted the sale of dangerous or ineffective medicine. When Upton Sinclair's powerful novel The Jungle showed the horrible meatpacking industry, Roosevelt pushed for the Meat Inspection Act to eliminate diseases that were transmitted in impure meat. Roosevelt also wanted an 8-hour workday, broader compensation for victims of industries, and other reforms. This and his criticism of conservatives in Congress and the judiciary led to a widening gulf between him and the conservative wing of his party. Roosevelt and conservation. Roosevelt's aggressive policies on conservation contributed to the gulf between him and the conservative wing of his party. He restricted private development of millions of acres of government land, mostly in the West. When conservatives in Congress restricted his authority over public lands, Roosevelt and his chief forester, Gifford Pinchot, seized them before the bill became law. Roosevelt cared about the conservation movement, the idea of preserving the natural world for ecological reasons. Pinchot became the first director of the National Forest Service, which promoted policies to protect lands. Federal aid to the West. Roosevelt backed the Newlands Act, which provided federal funds for the construction of dams, reservoirs, and canals in the West that would open new lands for cultivation and cheap electric power. The Hetch-Hetchy controversy. The Hetch-Hetchy was a valley in Yosemite National Park, but many residents of San Francisco saw Hetch-Hetchy as an ideal place for a dam. After the earthquake in 1906, more people wanted a dam, so Gifford Pinchot approved and the dam was constructed. There was a panic in 1907. To end the panic, J.P. Morgan bought the steel shares of the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company, and the Depression soon ended. The troubled secession. William Howard Taft became president after Roosevelt and easily won the election. However, Taft would leave office as the most defeated president of the 1900s, with his party deeply divided and the government in the hands of a Democratic administration for the first time in 20 years. Taft and the Progressives. Some reasons why people didn't like him was the Payne-Aldrich tariff. Taft sought to lower the tariff, but the reducing tariff was weak and scarcely lowered, and as some places raised the tariff. Taft also replaced the Secretary of the Interior with Richard A. Bollinger, and Bollinger was suspected to turn public coal lands to a private syndicate for personal profit. The return of Roosevelt. Roosevelt's return from his hunting safaris in Africa and tour of Europe was a major public event. He was very mad at Taft and was convinced that he was the only one who could reunite the Republicans. New nationalism was the principles that set in Roosevelt's speech in Kansas that justice was only possible through a strong federal government. He supported graduated income and inheritance taxes, workers' compensation for industrial accidents, regulation of the labor of women and children, tariff revision, and firmer regulation of corporations. Roosevelt versus Taft. Roosevelt was wanted by many, but Taft had the support of most party leaders who controlled the nominating process. The battle for nomination at the Chicago Convention made Taft win. Roosevelt summoned another convention to launch the new Progressive Party and nominate himself as its presidential candidate. The nickname Bull Moose Party was known for its commitment to the progressive cause. They wanted additional regulation of industry and trust, reform of many areas of government, compensation for injured workers, pensions for the elderly, and women's suffrage. But Roosevelt knew his campaign was hopeless because many of his Republican supporters did not follow him, and because of this, the strong Democrat nominee Woodrow Wilson won.